Have you ever wondered, in the quiet just before sleep, why so many royal portraits seem to show faces with strangely similar eyes, jaws that jut forward in unnatural ways, or noses that seem copied and pasted from one generation to the next? You might be lying there in the dim light of your room, maybe in Lahore, London, New York, or somewhere you won't admit, the night holding you still, and the thought comes like a whisper. What if the crown, the palace, the throne, all those glittering symbols were built not just on gold and power, but on the silent, secret unions of brother and sister? Imagine it, the flicker of candlelight against the gold leaf of a throne room, the heavy hush of court whispers, and two royal siblings bound not just by blood, but by marriage bed, walking past courtiers who bow because they must. Tonight, in this slow unraveling of history, I'll take you there, not into the grand battles or parades you've heard about, but into the private corridors of dynasties where the bloodline was so sacred it was never meant to be mixed with. The ordinary world where love was less about choice and more about keeping the royal blood pure, or so they believed. The truth is stranger, softer, and far darker than the textbooks bother to tell. Picture ancient Egypt, for example, the Nile's breeze slipping through carved stone halls, the smell of lotus flowers drifting from shallow pools, and in the heart of the palace, a young queen, barely 15, told she will marry not the boy from some foreign court, but her orator, because the gods according to the priests willed it. The reasoning is presented as divine, unbreakable. The Pharaoh is a living god, his sister a living goddess, and gods cannot marry mortals, so they marry each other. What you don't see in the hieroglyphs is the quiet dread that creeps into her before the wedding night, the knowledge that her life's path is already set. You also don't see the physicians years later, tending to their children, some strong, others weak and sickly, victims of what we now understand as genetic inbreeding. The pattern repeats, century after century, from Cleopatra's family to the pharaohs before her, each generation convinced they are preserving something holy, when in fact they are stacking the odds against their descendants. In Europe, the idea took on its form slightly less godlike, but no less obsessive. By the time you reach the Spanish Habsburgs in the 16th and 17th centuries, the portraits tell a quiet, undeniable truth. The famous Habsburg jaw, that elongated chin and underbite, wasn't an artistic quirk. It was a genetic hallmark of repeated inbreeding between cousins, uncles, nieces, and yes, sometimes siblings. The last of the line, Charles II of Spain, could barely speak or chew properly, and his body was a catalogue of illnesses that made his reign a living ghost story. You can almost imagine him, pale and slow-moving, in a dimly lit hall, trying to project royal dignity while courtiers pretended not to notice his frailty. But the truth sat heavy over the court. The dynasty was dying from within, not by swords or armies, but by the private, unbroken loop of its blood. Even in far-off Hawaii in the 19th century, the royal family maintained sibling marriages to protect the sacred chiefly blood, a practice viewed as divine by tradition, but tragic by modern understanding. And yet, each time, the same quiet calculation was made. Keep the power close, trust no outsider, preserve the blood. It's easy, here in the stillness of night, to think of this as history, a strange old custom that no longer exists. But imagine the rooms where those decisions were made soft carpets, absorbing the footsteps of royal advisors, the air thick with incense, and a young prince or princess being told their life partner had already been chosen since before they could walk, chosen from the same cradle they once shared. The public saw beauty, crowns, and celebrations. The private reality was far quieter and far more cruel. As we drift further into this story, remember, every crown has a cost, and sometimes that cost is hidden in the faces of children born into palaces. But the real question is, what happened when the blood became too pure, too tightly wound? That, my friend, is where the line between dynasty and doom begins to blur. And that's where we will go next thought. And so, when the blood became too pure, too tightly wound in the gilded cage of royal ambition, the cracks began to show in ways that were both subtle and catastrophic, weaving their way into the fabric of entire kingdoms until the thrones themselves trembled under the weight of what could not be undone. Picture a candlelit chamber in a 17th century European palace, where the polished marble floors reflected the glow of hundreds of flames, and the air carried the faint scent of beeswax and rosewater. In the center sat a council of advisors debating the next marriage alliance for the young heir, a boy of barely 16, who, as fate would have it, was to marry his oyster. Their reasoning was rehearsed and polite spoken in the language of duty and tradition, but under the smooth veneer lay the unspoken truth. Every time the circle of marriage drew tighter, every time the family tree doubled back on itself, it locked another door against the outside world, and another strand of weakness wound into the DNA of the next generation. The Spanish Habsburgs, already bearing the marks of centuries of intermarriage, became the most notorious example. By the time Charles II took the throne in 1665, his bloodline was a near-closed loop, his family tree resembling more a twisted vine that had wrapped in on itself than a spreading oak. Court physicians whispered of his ailments in voices they hoped the king would never overhear. He was infertile, plagued by epilepsy, and prone to bouts of confusion that left him unable to recall simple details. Chronic illness had become a shadow in the halls, an uninvited but permanent guest at the royal table. Across the sea in Egypt, long before the Habsburg name existed, the ancient Ptolemaic dynasty had danced the same dangerous steps, where Cleopatra's family tree was littered with sibling marriages, their reasoning tied to the gods, but the results bound firmly to the earth, where children often bore the marks of genetic fragility, short lifespans, susceptibility to disease, and in some cases, deformities that were quietly erased from the tell. Official records. These royal unions were draped in ceremonial splendor, with gold crowns, silk robes, and priestly blessings. But behind the silks and jewels, there were sighs in the night, the quiet sound of a palace physician closing the door, softly after delivering news no royal wanted to hear. Even in the high islands of Hawaii, sibling marriage was sanctified as a means to preserve mana, the sacred spiritual power believed to be inherent in the chiefly blood. Yet this practice, so deeply woven into cultural and religious life, also wove in threads of fragility that would later be seen in declining health and reduced fertility, echoing the same patterns from Europe to Africa. The more the blood was protected, the more it was endangered from within, like sealing a rare flower in a glass dome, only to find it withering from lack of fresh air. Courtiers rarely spoke of such matters openly, for to do so was to question not just the wisdom of the rulers, but the will of the gods themselves, or the divine right of kings, in Europe's case. Instead, the truth passed in quiet gestures. A midwife's bowed head, a physician's furrowed brow, a servant's sidelong glance when the young prince failed to walk as early as expected. And yet, despite these signs, the cycle continued, driven by the fear of losing power to outsiders, by the belief that royal blood must remain royal, untainted by the common touch. It is here, in this pattern of willful blindness, that the tragedy deepens, not just in the physical toll, but in the psychological weight carried by those born into it. Imagine growing up knowing that your spouse was chosen from the same cradle, that your children might inherit not just your titles and lands, but your weaknesses and ailments. The portraits from these eras show serene faces, posed in perfect stillness, but if you look long enough, you begin to see the strain in the eyes, the set of the mouth, the stiffness in posture that speaks of pain hidden beneath layers of velvet and gold. And for every ruler who managed to hold their kingdom together, despite these private afflictions, There were those whose reigns were cut short, not by rebellion or war, but by the slow erosion of health and mind. That is the dark undercurrent. Of these bloodlines, a quiet collapse that begins in the marrow and ends in the history books as a footnote, though it was, for those who lived it, the central tragedy of their lives. And as the next part of our journey unfolds, we will step deeper into the personal stories hidden behind those grand facades, where love was an order, not a choice, and the cost was measured in lives lost before their time. To step closer now is to leave the grand sweep of dynastic charts and the cool detachment of historian summaries, and instead slip into the inner rooms where the human cost of sibling inbreeding unfolded like a slow-burning tragedy, muffled by the heavy curtains of protocol and ritual, but never truly hidden from those who lived within those walls. Imagine the stone corridors of an ancient Egyptian palace, sunlight spilling in slanted beams through high windows, catching motes of dust that dance lazily in the air, while beyond the carved cedar doors, a royal daughter sits still as a statue, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished floor. She is betrothed to her brother, the heir, and the day's ceremonies have been set in motion. Musicians tuning lyres in the courtyard, priests preparing incense, servants carrying trays of figs and honey. No one asks her opinion. It has been decided since before she could speak. The priests tell her she is a goddess incarnate, that her union will keep Egypt's gods smiling on the Nile's floods. But in her stomach, there is a tightness she cannot name, an unease that comes from knowing her future is bound, not by love or adventure, but by a chain forged of blood and law. Generations later, in a completely different world, a Spanish princess stands before a mirror in the dim light of a winter afternoon. Her hair is being braided by a lady-in-waiting, the golden threads woven into it catching the firelight, and on the table nearby rests the crown she will wear at her wedding or grew. A cousin so close in blood he could have been her brother. The Habsburg dynasty has been tightening its circle for centuries, each marriage a calculated move to preserve territories and titles. And the result is that the guest list is made almost entirely of relatives. Behind her, the lady-in-waiting hums softly, unaware of the bitter taste the princess feels in her throat. The portraits of her ancestors line the walls, each face with the same prominent jaw, the same downward tilted eyes, a gallery of genetic inevitability. When her children come, if they come at all, they may be frail, prone to illness. She knows this from whispers in the corridors, from the way courtiers avoid mentioning the stillbirths and sickly heirs in the family's past. Even far from Europe, in the lush, fragrant air of 19th century Hawaii, a royal brother and sister are prepared for a marriage meant to safeguard the sacred mana of their chiefly blood. The ocean crashes against the black volcanic rocks beyond the palace walls, the sound steady and ancient, while inside, Kahili feather standards sway in the warm breeze, a reminder that this union is both political and spiritual. Yet the bride, dressed in a kapa cloth of the finest weave, glances once out toward the sea, as if imagining a life beyond the palace, beyond the role assigned to her before birth. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeats. These marriages are framed in the language of duty and sanctity, but underneath, they carry a toll paid in health, in freedom, in the quiet erosion of vitality over generations. And those who lived within these arrangements bore not just the physical consequences, but the psychological ones. The pressure to produce heirs despite failing bodies, the isolation from any true romantic choice, a constant awareness that one's private. Life was a matter of state. It is easy now to read about them and imagine their world as impossibly distant. But the human emotions, resignation, longing, fear remain close enough to touch. We can see them in the careful poses of old portraits and the surviving letters, where a princess might confess her loneliness to a trusted friend, in the diary of a court physician noting, with restrained dread, the failing health of yet another royal child. And as we look more closely at these individual stories, a deeper truth emerges, that while the crowns and thrones may have seemed eternal, the bodies that carried them were as fragile as any, perhaps more so for being trapped in this gilded loop. In the next step of our journey, we will move from these glimpses into the most extreme and tragic cases, those where the cost of keeping the bloodline pure was nothing less than the slow extinction of the dynasty itself. The slow extinction of a dynasty rarely comes with a single dramatic collapse. More often it arrives like a long winter, creeping silently through the corridors of palaces, dimming the vitality of each generation until there is nothing left to pass on but titles and empty rooms. Imagine Spain in the late 17th century, its once vast empire still draped in the symbols of power gold from the New World, fleets of ships returning from distant colonies, a court glittering with brocade and jewels, but in the heart of it all, King Charles II, the last of the Habsburg line, walks slowly down a cold stone hallway, his footsteps echoing under high, painted ceilings. His jaw juts forward, so far that chewing is painful. He speaks in a slow, slurred voice, his words difficult to understand, even for those who love him. His body is frail, his legs weak, and his mind clouded by illness. At 39, he looks decades older. Physicians whisper that his lineage has been folded over on itself for too long, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, brother to sister, and now the royal tree can no longer bear healthy fruit. In his private chambers, remedies are brewed from strange mixtures of herbs, wine, and even powdered gemstones, as if wealth itself could cure what centuries of inbreeding have wrought. Yet each effort fails, and the court grows restless, for without an Heir, the Habsburg crown will slip away. Far to the south, centuries earlier, the Ptolemies of Egypt met their quiet decline, their sibling marriages framed as divine unions. To honor gods like Osiris and Isis, produced rulers who were sometimes as fragile in body as they were fierce in politics. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of them all, came from a family where brother-sister unions were the norm, and while she was formidable in intellect and charisma, the pattern around her was already fraying the dynasty's strength. Beyond palaces and temples, the people lived their lives by the Nile, planting crops, fishing, trading in the markets, but in the royal courts, the bloodline was closing in on itself like a tightening knot. Even in the Hawaiian kingdom, where sibling marriage among high chiefs was a deeply sacred practice, European visitors quietly noted the health issues that sometimes plagued the children of these unions, though such observations were rarely spoken, allowed for fear of offending the Ali nobility. Across these worlds, the signs were the same. Infant mortality rates higher than the common folk, young heirs dying before reaching maturity, adult rulers weakened by conditions that today we recognize as genetic disorders. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that these were not accidents. They were the result of deliberate policy, of a belief that the royal blood was too precious to dilute. And yet, even as the physical evidence mounted, tradition held fast, the past weighing heavier than the future. It was easier to lose a generation than to risk the shame of marrying into a lesser house. In the dim candlelight of council chambers, advisors would point to history, to religion, to the examples of past rulers, never admitting that those very examples were also cautionary tales. Servants saw more than they ever said, the way a queen's hands trembled when she held her newborn, the way a king's eyes clouded over during ceremonies, the quiet funerals held at dawn for children whose names were never announced. In the grand halls, the portraits of ancestors stared down with the same eyes, the same jawline, the same features repeating until they became almost eerie in their sameness. A visual record of how small a royal world could become when it was, walled in by its own rules. And so, the line would shrink until one final ruler bore the weight of generations, like the last leaf clinging to a branch in late autumn. Some of these last rulers met their end with dignity, others in bitterness, but nearly all left behind the same unspoken lesson, that in protecting their blood, they had poisoned it. As we move forward, we'll step into the most intimate chambers of these fading dynasties, to see how those who lived under the crown navigated lives where love, duty, and survival were bound together in knots that could never be untied. 2. Walk into those intimate chambers now is to feel the weight of lives shaped not by their own choices, but by centuries of decisions made long before they were born, the air inside heavy with incense, candle wax, and the unspoken knowledge that every marriage here is a transaction for the sake of lineage. In an Egyptian palace during the Ptolemaic period, you might find a brother and sister seated at opposite ends of a long cedar table, a polished surface gleaming with gold bowls of dates and figs, their eyes meeting only briefly under the watchful gaze of servants and priests. Outside, the Nile glides by in its eternal rhythm, the city alive with merchants calling their wares, fishermen unloading their morning catch. But inside these walls, the rhythm is different, slower, more suffocating. The young queen knows her role, to bear children who will carry both her blood and her brother's, sealing the divine circle the priests have sworn must remain unbroken. She has been told since childhood that their union keeps Egypt strong, that their love is sacred, but the word love feels hollow, replaced by duty, ritual, and the constant pressure to produce heirs who will live beyond infancy. Centuries later, in a dimly lit Spanish royal bedroom, another royal couple, this time cousins so close in blood they might as well be siblings, lie in silence. The heavy velvet drapes block out the morning light, the air inside thick with the scent of lavender meant to soothe the queen's nerves. She has suffered 2 miscarriages in as many years, each one leaving her weaker, each one whispered about by courtiers who lower their voices when she passes. Her husband, bearing the infamous Habsburg jaw, says little. He too carries the burden of knowing their family's bloodline is fragile, yet neither can defy the expectation to try again. Across the ocean in Hawaii, the Ali'i Nui, high chiefs, observe their traditions, and a royal brother and sister walk barefoot along the polished koa wood floors of their palace, the warm Pacific breeze drifting through open shutters. Their world is vibrant ceremonial feasts, chants that echo under the stars, the scent of leis, but the private reality is much the same. An unchosen bond, sacred in the eyes of their people, inescapable in their hearts. These couples navigate a strange dual existence, public faces filled with composure, private lives filled with moments of resignation, quiet grief, and sometimes a flicker of defiance that never quite finds form. The inbreeding that binds them is not a single act, but a chain, each link forged by generations before them, and the weight of it presses down in ways that cannot be seen in the official portraits. It shows in the stilted way they speak to one another, in the careful way they hold a child too frail to survive the winter, in the way they avoid looking too long at the empty cradle in the corner of the room. Physicians, whether in ancient Thebes, Renaissance Madrid, or 19th century Honolulu, become silent witnesses to the cycle, tending to ailments they cannot cure because the illness is written into the very blood. The knowledge of this truth moves quietly through the palace, carried in lowered voices, in sideways glances, in the way a midwife closes her eyes for a moment before placing a newborn into its mother's arms. And yet, for all the sorrow that pools in these hidden rooms, the cycle endures, for it is not just tradition, but power itself that demands it. To marry outside the bloodline would mean sharing power, risking influence, and in the royal mind, there are some prices too high to pay. Never mind that the price they are already paying is their future. It is in these private spaces, lit by the wavering light of oil lamps or candles, that we see the most human faces of this practice. Not just rulers, but men and women caught in the machinery of monarchy, bound by the decisions of the dead, trying to live lives that were mapped out centuries before they drew breath. And as we press forward, we will step even closer to moments where the pressure to produce heirs collides with the slow, inevitable toll of inbreeding moments that will reveal not just the fragility of these royal lines, but the quiet resilience, and sometimes rebellion, of those trapped within them. Resilience in such gilded captivity often came in small, almost invisible forms, a shared glance between siblings that carried a private understanding, a carefully coded letter to a trusted confidant, a rare decision to delay a ceremonial union under the pretense of illness. But rebellion was dangerous, and in most cases, it was only a thought, never acted upon, because to defy the marriage expectations of a royal house was to risk exile, disgrace, or even execution. The demand for heirs loomed over every palace, like an unending season. It was the quiet drumbeat that marked the passing of months, the measure by which a queen's worth and a prince's success were judged. In the Egyptian court of the later Ptolemies, a young queen married to her brother would undergo elaborate fertility rituals under the direction of priests, standing barefoot on cool temple stone as sacred oils were rubbed into her skin, her eyes fixed on a statue of Hathor or Isis. Outside the temple, the city moved on, scribes tallying grain harvests, fishermen mending nets, but inside, every gesture was a desperate attempt to secure a child strong enough to survive infancy. Sometimes these efforts succeeded, but often they did not, and the stillbirths and early deaths were met with public mourning, veiled in ceremonial language, while in private, the grief was sharp and personal. In Europe's grand courts, the cycle was no less intense. Consider a 16th century Habsburg princess, pale from repeated pregnancies, seated on a cushioned chair in a chamber heavy with the scent of frankincense, her ladies fussing with her hair, while a court physician quietly discusses her declining health with an advisor in the corner. The words, too much strain and weak constitution, are spoken in hushed tones, but the meaning is clear. Each pregnancy pushes her closer to death, and yet the pressure to try again will not relent until a healthy male heir is produced. The king, her cousin, enters and offers a brief, formal smile, his mind on matters of state, but beneath that mask, he too feels the weight of knowing that without children, their marriage is a political failure. Even in Hawaii, where sibling marriage was seen through the lens of divine tradition, the strain of producing heirs was deeply felt. A royal couple might participate in a multi-day ceremony involving chants, feasts, and symbolic offerings to the gods of fertility, all under the watchful eyes of their kahuna, priests. But when months passed without signs of a pregnancy, the whispers would begin, not just among the common people, but within the royal court itself. Inbreeding, though rarely named as the cause, hovered like a shadow over these struggles, quietly, increasing the odds of miscarriage, stillbirth, and childhood illness. The tension between public expectation and private reality created an atmosphere of constant, low-level dread. Every late menstruation was a flicker of hope. Every sudden cramp or unexplained fever in a child was a moment of silent terror. And when an heir was finally born, there was no guarantee that the victory would last. Diseases, congenital conditions, or frailty could claim them before they reached their first birthday. Behind the public displays of joy, the private moments were often filled with cautious optimism tinged with fear. This is where resilience mattered most. A queen enduring the loss of multiple children, but still presenting herself at court as serene and untouchable. A king refusing to remarry despite pressure from his advisors. A couple quietly agreeing to adopt a relative's child as heir to ease the strain on their bodies. These were small acts of agency in a system designed to strip them away. And yet, for all the quiet defiance, the cycle continued, because in the end, royal duty always outweighed personal survival. As we move forward, we will come face to face with the most heartbreaking consequences of that unyielding demand for heirs, exploring the lives that began under the brightest of crowns and ended in the shadow of the very blood that gave them their titles. The shadow of that blood fell heaviest on the smallest and most vulnerable infants, born into the echoing marble chambers of palaces, swaddled in silk, surrounded by attendants, and yet marked from the first breath by the fragile inheritance of centuries of closed-loop unions. In Egypt's late Ptolemaic period, the birth of a royal child was a spectacle. The wails of the newborn were met with the beating of drums, the lighting of incense, and the chanting of priests who proclaimed the God's blessing on the new life. But in the private quarters, away from the gilded halls, the midwives could see what the ceremonies would never reveal: a child's limbs, weaker than they should be, the tremor in tiny hands, the listlessness that was not simply the softness of youth, but the early sign of a life that would not grow strong. These were the moments when the physician's eyes would meet and hold for a second too long, when a nursemaid would tighten her grip on the child, as if her arms alone could hold off fate. Centuries later, in the Spanish Habsburg court, such scenes repeated with a different backdrop. Heavy velvet curtains drawn against the winter cold, a cradle carved from walnut and lined with lace, a crowd of courtiers waiting in the antechamber for news. A baby boy, heir to vast realms, is born pale and quiet, his jaw already showing the protrusion that will later mark him as his father's son in the most unfortunate way. The physicians check his breathing, his reflexes, and nod with forced optimism, but they know the truth. His blood carries the compounded risks of generations of intermarriage, risks that no amount of wealth or prayer can undo. And as months pass, the royal couple's joy becomes a careful kind of love, always shadowed by worry. In Hawaii's royal courts, a similar pattern emerges. A child born to sibling rulers is celebrated with chants and the waving of kahili feather. Standards, yet behind the ceremonial smiles, the elders exchange glances, remembering other children who had not survived their second or third year. The palace nurses are vigilant, knowing that illness can strike suddenly in these precious heirs, and that a single fever can tip the balance from life to death. What makes these tragedies more piercing is that they were not seen as preventable. No, one dared to question the practice that caused them, because to do so would have been to question the foundation of the royal family's power. Instead, grief was folded neatly into ritual, each funeral as elaborate as the birth celebration had been, the loss absorbed into the pageantry of monarchy. For the parents, however, the pain was raw and unrelenting. It was a quiet devastation carried beneath layers of protocol, a smile at court masking the ache that settled deep in their bones. Over time, the succession plans of entire kingdoms were thrown into disarray as infant mortality robbed them of heirs. Regents were appointed for children too sickly to rule alone. Power shifted unexpectedly to distant cousins, and sometimes the throne passed out of the family entirely, not because of conquest, but because the bloodline had simply withered. In the candlelit libraries of these palaces, scribes recorded the births and deaths in careful script. The lines for some children so short they looked like afterthoughts, yet each represented a life once greeted with joy and ended in silence. These stories, stripped of the grandeur, are deeply human. Parents watching helplessly as their children fade, siblings who become both spouse and co-mourner, dynasties forced to face the fact that the very thing they guarded most fiercely, their blood, was also their undoing. And as we continue, we will step into the moments when these losses forced monarchs to confront an impossible choice: cling to tradition and risk extinction, or open the gates of the bloodline to the outside world, breaking a sacred chain that had defined them for centuries. Breaking a chain that had been bound link by link over centuries was no simple act. For monarchs raised from birth to see sibling or close-kin marriage as the foundation of their authority, the idea of marrying an outsider was as shocking as surrendering a crown. Yet as dynasties watched heir after heir fade into illness or die in infancy, the choice began to press on them like an unwelcome dawn, impossible to ignore. In the late years of the Spanish Habsburgs, whispers began to circulate in the private council chambers. Perhaps a match could be made with a foreign princess of impeccable, if non-Habsburg, lineage. Perhaps the purity of the bloodline could survive one dilution if it meant producing an heir strong enough to hold the throne. Advisors argued in low voices beneath the glittering chandeliers, the smell of burning tallow mixing with the scent of old parchment as marriage contracts were discreetly drawn and then just as quickly burned when opposition rose. In Egypt, toward the decline of the Ptolemies, political necessity sometimes forced the crown to consider alliances beyond the family circle, especially when Rome's shadow began to loom over the Nile. Cleopatra VII herself broke from the strict sibling marriage mold in her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, relationships that were as much about survival as they were about personal connection. Yet even these departures from tradition were seen as acts of political theater, not true reform. The idea of consistently marrying outside the divine circle remained anathema to the priests who guarded the ideological heart of the dynasty. In Hawaii, the arrival of European powers and the growing influence of Christianity brought pressure to abandon sibling marriage altogether, framing it as immoral in the eyes of the missionaries. For the Alii Nui, this was not just a religious dispute, it was a direct challenge to their authority, their mana, their identity. The decision to marry outside the sibling bond was therefore loaded with cultural consequences, and those who took it risked alienating the very people they were meant to lead. In each of these contexts, the moment of potential change came with an almost unbearable tension. The fear that breaking tradition would unravel the spiritual and political legitimacy of the monarchy weighed against the knowledge that keeping it might guarantee the extinction of the line. Behind closed doors, monarchs wrestled with the problem late into the night, pacing across mosaic floors, standing at balconies while the city slept, running their fingers along the spines of books in private libraries as if the histories within might yield an answer. Some ultimately chose to break the chain, arranging marriages with distant royals whose blood was fresh to their court. And in a few cases, it worked. Healthy heirs were born, and the dynasty breathed again, at least for a time. Others hesitated too long, trapped in the belief that the gods or God, or the very idea of monarchy itself, would punish such defiance. In those courts, the cycle of inbreeding ground on until the line simply ended, leaving behind empty thrones and contested successions. What is striking looking back is how these decisions were often framed not in terms of health or science concepts still in their infancy, but in terms of loyalty, honor, and fate. A ruler might say, "It is better to die with our blood pure than to live with it mixed," as if the blood itself were the kingdom. Yet for those who did leap, who married beyond the familiar embrace of a sibling or cousin, the world often shifted in unexpected ways. New alliances formed, new cultures mingled at court, and sometimes, for the first time in generations, a royal child ran through the palace halls with the unself-conscious vigor of youth. These were the rare glimmers of what could be when the chain was loosened, though they came too late for many. In the next chapter of our journey, we will look at the dynasties that chose change and those that refused, and see how those decisions shaped the twilight years of their reigns, for better or for worse. For better or for worse, the fork in the road between those who broke the cycle and those who clung to it became one of the great dividing lines in the histories of royal houses, shaping not only the lives of the rulers themselves, but the political landscapes of entire regions. In Europe, a few Habsburg branches that dared to marry beyond their tightly wound family tree off into foreign royals from France, Portugal, or minor German states sometimes saw immediate improvement in the health of their heirs. A young prince born to a mixed union might run in the palace gardens with a strength and vitality that seemed almost shocking to courtiers who had grown used to delicate, sickly heirs. These healthy children became living proof to some advisors that the purity of blood was less important than its survival. Yet elsewhere in the same family, branches that refused to break the chain dwindled into extinction. Their last rulers remembered more for their ailments than their accomplishments. Charles II of Spain's tragic reign, with his physical disabilities and mental decline, was one such endpoint of visible warning to all, though few heeded it until too late. In Egypt, the Ptolemies who intermarried beyond their sibling circles, whether through strategic unions with foreign generals, or, in Cleopatra's case, powerful Roman statesmen briefly injected new political energy into the dynasty. But these unions often provoked backlash from those who saw them as betrayals of divine tradition, and in some cases, they accelerated the dynasty's collapse by inviting foreign influence into the heart of the court. The choice was never a clean one. To marry outside meant risking legitimacy in the eyes of the people. To marry inside meant risking the very survival of the line. In Hawaii, the eventual abandonment of sibling marriage under missionary pressure and political change created a different kind of split. Those who adapted formed new alliances and integrated with the shifting power structures of the islands, while others saw the break as the beginning of the end for the old ways. Their mana diminished in the eyes of traditionalists. Across these different worlds, the fates of dynasties that broke tradition often hinged on timing and circumstance. A ruler who acted early, before the inbreeding had compounded into widespread hereditary illness, could salvage the health of their descendants and stabilize succession. But for those who waited until the family tree was so entangled it could barely sustain new growth, the change often came too late. The public, too, reacted in unpredictable ways. In some courts, the arrival of a foreign-born queen or prince was met with fascination, lavish welcomes, and the hope of renewal. In others, it sparked suspicion, xenophobia, and resistance, with whispers that the monarchy had been contaminated. And yet, the personal lives of these rulers, whether they married siblings or outsiders, were often far more complex than the political narrative suggested. A king who took a foreign bride might still mourn the loss of the sister he had been raised to believe would be his wife. A queen married to her brother might quietly envy the freer unions of foreign monarchs. The private diaries and correspondence that survive from these eras hint at a range of emotions: relief, regret, longing that rarely made it into official records. Over time, the decisions of each dynasty became a kind of legacy in themselves, their consequences rippling forward into the health, stability, and even cultural identity of the generations that followed. Some houses that embraced change saw their bloodlines continue, though not always their power. Others that refused faded entirely, leaving behind only the portraits, coins, and tombs that tell of a line once proud, now silent. And as we move deeper into this story, we will turn to the most haunting aspect of all: how these choices, whether to break the chain or preserve it, were remembered, rewritten, and sometimes erased in the histories that followed, shaping how we see these rulers today. Shaping how we see these rulers today has as much to do with what was left out of the official record as with what was preserved. For the truth of sibling inbreeding in royal bloodlines was often softened, reworded, or deliberately erased. Protect the dignity of the crown. Chroniclers in ancient courts were not neutral historians. They were employees of the monarch, dependent on royal favor for their livelihood, and their pens moved according to what was politically safe. In the Ptolemaic palaces of Egypt, scribes chiseling inscriptions into temple walls might portray a brother-sister marriage as a union of gods, complete with divine symbols and sacred blessings, while making no mention of the miscarriages, infant deaths, or congenital conditions that followed. The hieroglyphs carved into limestone tell a story of eternal stability, even as the living reality within the palace was fragile and uncertain. In Europe, court historians working for the Habsburgs faced a similar dilemma. Portraits were commissioned to present rulers in the prime of health, even when the subject could barely stand unaided. Painters subtly adjusted features, smoothing over the extreme jut of the Habsburg jaw, adding a flush of color to pale, drawn cheeks. The official family trees printed in grand genealogical books listed marriages between siblings or first cousins with the same formality as any other union, offering no hint that these choices were part of a closed loop that was slowly undermining the dynasty's strength. In Hawaii, oral histories were the primary means of preserving the past, and these, too, could be shaped by those in power. Genealogies of the Aili Ainui celebrated the sacredness of sibling marriage, highlighting its connection to mana, while downplaying or omitting stories of children lost young or rulers weakened by illness. Later, as foreign missionaries and colonial administrators took control of written records, they reframed these traditions in moralistic terms, often stripping them of cultural nuance. The result is that much of what we know today about the human cost of sibling inbreeding comes not from official records, but from peripheral sources: the diaries of foreign diplomats, letters between minor courtiers, medical notes preserved in archives, or archaeological evidence that speaks where words were silent. Even modern historians face the challenge of piecing together a truth that was never meant to be fully told, reconstructing family trees that resemble tangled knots, analyzing portraits for signs of inherited deformities, and reading between the lines of diplomatic correspondence to find traces of the personal tragedies that shaped political decisions. The deliberate concealment served a purpose in its time protecting the image of the monarchy, maintaining public confidence, and preserving the illusion of divine or natural right. Yet it also ensured that future generations would inherit a distorted view, one in which the grandeur of crowns and ceremonies was unshadowed by the frailty of the bodies that wore them. This rewriting of history not only shaped public memory, but also influenced how subsequent rulers saw themselves and their duties. A young king might grow up believing his ancestors were untainted by human weakness, never realizing that the illnesses he suffered were part of a long pattern. In some cases, when the truth did surface through rumors, scandals, or the visible decline of a monarch, it shocked subjects and foreign observers alike, forcing them to reconcile the image of unshakable power with the reality of a bloodline in crisis. And so, the story of sibling inbreeding and royal bloodlines is as much about memory and myth as it is about biology and politics. In the next stage of our journey, we will step into that space where truth and myth overlap, exploring how legends grew around these rulers, how whispers of their private lives transformed into folklore, and how even the most tragic realities could be recast into tales of destiny. Destiny was the easiest mask to place over the faces of rulers whose lives had been shaped by sibling inbreeding, for it allowed both the court and the people to reframe what might otherwise seem like a flaw or a failure into something inevitable, even noble. In the retelling, the private discomfort of a brother-sister union became an act of divine will, a romanticized union that fulfilled prophecies or preserved cosmic balance. In ancient Egypt, poets in the royal court composed hymns that spoke of the pharaoh and his sister queen as living embodiments of gods like Osiris and Isis, their marriage a celestial event that ensured the Nile's yearly flood. These verses, recited at festivals, and carved into temple walls, left no space for the reality of stillbirths or fragile heirs. Instead, they painted a picture of eternal harmony, a love that transcended mortal limitations. Centuries later, in Europe, troubadours and chroniclers would cloak the Habsburgs' close-kin marriages in the language of dynastic honor, emphasizing the unbroken lineage that connected a ruler to Charlemagne or saints of the Catholic Church. In their stories, the shared bloodline was not a genetic risk, but a badge of purity, a shield against the dilution of noble heritage. In Hawaii, the chants of the Aliai Nui preserved the sanctity of sibling marriage as a tradition that maintained the sacred mana of the ruling class, embedding it into the spiritual and cultural identity of the islands. To question the practice was to question the spiritual order itself, and so the stories that survived speak of these unions as sources of strength, omitting the quieter realities of grief and loss. Over time, these myths were not merely propaganda. They became part of the collective memory, so deeply woven into the fabric of identity that even those who suffered from the practice might accept its romanticized form. Portraits reinforced the narrative royal couples, posed together in ways that suggested unity and shared purpose. Their physical similarities presented as signs of harmony rather than warning signs of genetic closeness. In later centuries, especially during the rise of nationalism, these stories took on new life, recast to fit the ideals of the era. A sibling marriage from centuries past might be held up as proof of a nation's ancient and unbroken sovereignty, or as a symbol of resistance to foreign influence. The uncomfortable biological truths faded further into the background, replaced by a kind of historical pageantry that prioritized symbolism over substance. Yet even as these myths took hold, there were always undercurrents folktales, satirical, plays, whispered gossip that told a different story, one of rulers cursed by their arrogance, of families whose downfall came not from enemy swords, but from their wedding beds. In some regions, these alternative narratives became cautionary tales told to commoners, warning against pride and insularity. In others, they survived only in the private writings of those close enough to the court to see the truth. The coexistence of myth and reality created a strange dual history, one that celebrated the same events it should have mourned. And this duality would persist into the modern age, influencing how scholars, writers, and the public interpret these royal unions today. In the next part of our journey, we will leave behind the softened glow of legend and return to the stark light of lived experience, examining the daily lives of sibling royal couples, the routines, rituals, and private negotiations that defined marriages bound as much by politics as by blood. To step inside the private quarters of a sibling royal marriage is to enter a world that exists in two layers at once: the polished, ceremonial facade shown to the court and the public, and the quieter, more complicated reality that plays out behind closed doors. In the grand palace of a Ptolemaic pharaoh, dawn begins not with the casual stirrings of an ordinary household, but with the measured sequence of servants entering in near silence, bearing trays of scented oils, fresh fruit, and ritual garments. The queen, sister to the king, is attended first. Her hair is combed and braided with beads of lapis lazuli, her eyes lined with kohl, her wrists circled with gold. The king's attendants prepare him separately, smoothing linen robes and fastening a wide collar of turquoise and gold around his neck. They will appear together in the audience hall as the embodiment of divine unity, their matching features high cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, similar jawlines interpreted as signs of harmony rather than the genetic closeness they truly reflect. Beyond the public rituals, their private life is governed by a mix of familiarity and formality. They grew up in the same nursery, learned to read from the same tutors, and now share a bedchamber whose walls are painted with scenes of gods and goddesses that mirror their onion. Conversations often circle matters of state, the scheduling of festivals, the progress of building projects, and the latest reports from the priests about the flooding of the Nile. Love, in the romantic sense, may or may not exist. Affection can grow from shared experience, but just as often, resentment simmers quietly beneath the surface. In 17th century Madrid, a Habsburg brother and sister, or more often, close cousins, live in a similar duality. Mornings begin with the queen receiving her ladies-in-waiting, discussing the latest court intrigues while her husband attends to ministers in an adjacent room. At midday, they dine together in a hall lined with tapestries, their conversation measured, each word potentially overheard by servants or visiting dignitaries. Afternoons are filled with separate duties. She oversees the royal household, charitable works, and the education of any surviving children. He attends councils, hunts, or inspects the guard. Only in the late evening do they find themselves alone. And even then, privacy is never complete. Guards stand in the corridor, and the walls themselves seem to listen. In the Hawaiian royal courts, a brother-sister marriage follows rhythms shaped by island tradition. The day may begin with chants offered to the ancestors, followed by communal meals under the open sky, where the royal couple sits side by side as living symbols of mana. Their duties include presiding over ceremonies, settling disputes among the alii, and participating in seasonal rituals tied to the land and sea. Yet when the ceremonies end and the leis are set aside, they return to the same complex reality, shared by their counterparts in other parts of the world, navigating a relationship that is as much a political alliance as it is a family bond. In all these contexts, intimacy is layered with duty, and affection is often tempered by the knowledge that the marriage was never a choice. For some couples, this shared fate fosters a quiet solidarity. For others, it breeds distance, with each retreating into their circle of confidence and distractions. The pressure to produce heirs runs like a current beneath everything, every shared glance, every illness, every ceremonial appearance. Success in this duty brings temporary relief. Failure brings renewed scrutiny from advisors, priests, and the public. The routines of their days, from the morning dressing rituals to the formal processions, serve both to display their unity and to conceal whatever tensions might exist between them. And yet, within these carefully managed routines, there are moments small, fleeting, when the human heart asserts itself. A private joke exchanged during a long ceremony, a hand squeezed. In silent comfort during a difficult audience, a shared memory of childhood that briefly softens the rigid roles they inhabit. These moments do not undo the burdens they carry, but they remind us that behind the political construct of sibling marriage were two people, each navigating the strange intersection of kinship, duty, and personal longing. In the next stage of our journey, we will follow these marriages into the later years of the rulers' lives, when age, illness, and the cumulative effects of inbreeding begin to press heavily on both the body and the stability of the dynasty itself. The later years of sibling royal couples carried a heaviness that was both physical and symbolic, for as their bodies began to show the accumulated toll of decades of shared lineage, so too did their kingdoms begin to strain under the fragility of their rule. In the cool corridors of a Ptolemaic palace, the once vigorous king walks slowly now, his steps shuffling on polished stone, one hand resting heavily on the arm of his sister queen. Their resemblance, once paraded as proof of divine unity, now emphasizes the shared signs of age, the same slight stoop of the shoulders, the same tired shadows beneath the eyes, the same stiffness in movement. The years of ceremonial appearances, religious processions, and court obligations have etched themselves into their bones. Physicians bring trays of remedies, crushed herbs mixed into honey, oils infused with lotus and myrrh, but the ailments are deep-rooted, a mixture of time's natural wear and the less visible consequences of generations of close kinship. In Spain, a Habsburg royal couple in their later years moves through similarly dim halls, the heavy tapestries muffling their footsteps. The king's once bright eyes are clouded by cataracts, his jaw still marked by the family's infamous protrusion now, hangs slightly open as if perpetually fatigued. His queen, also his cousin, suffers from joint pain so severe that she must be carried to formal audiences. Their surviving children, if any, are often frail themselves, some already gone to the family crypt. Advisors murmur about the question of succession, and foreign ambassadors send coded letters home, noting the monarch's declining health with a mixture of pity and political calculation. In Hawaii, a royal brother and sister in the final chapter of their reign stand together at a ceremonial feast, their faces serene before the crowd, but the queen's hands tremble slightly as she lifts a cup of awa, and the king leans more heavily than before on his carved staff. The chants honor their long reign and the sacredness of their bond. Yet the elders present cannot help but remember the children who did not survive, the heirs who might have carried their legacy forward, but whose lives were cut short. In all these settings, the later years bring a deepening awareness that time is no longer a distant horizon, but a pressing presence, and with it comes the unspoken fear that the dynasty may not survive their passing. The signs are everywhere: fewer public appearances, longer periods of seclusion, sudden policy changes meant to secure succession, and the quiet arrival of distant relatives at court potential heirs brought in from the outer branches of the family tree. Yet even in this twilight, the rituals continue, as though repetition could hold off the inevitable. The king and queen appear at festivals, their steps slower, but their faces composed, the people cheering with a devotion that blends loyalty with nostalgia. Behind the scenes, the palace becomes a place of careful management. Physicians charting symptoms, ministers negotiating marriages for any surviving heirs, scribes updating genealogies with names that may soon be all that remains of a once mighty line. The personal intimacy between the royal siblings in these years can shift in unexpected ways, sometimes deepening into a kind of quiet companionship born of shared trials, sometimes fracturing under the weight of mutual disappointments and unspoken regrets. They know better than anyone how much has been lost, and how much depends on their ability to carry the image of strength to the very end. And yet, even as their health declines and their political influence wanes, they remain symbols living, embodiments of a tradition that has both sustained and doomed their line. As the next chapter unfolds, we will move into the moments when death finally comes for one half of these unions, and the surviving spouse-sibling is left to navigate a throne that suddenly feels much larger and lonelier than before. When death finally claimed one half of the sibling royal union, the absence was felt in every stone of the palace, in the hollow echo of footsteps along corridors once shared, and in the silent spaces between ceremonies that had always been performed together. The surviving spouse-sibling was left not only with the personal grief of losing a partner who had been by their side since childhood, but with the destabilizing reality that the crown now sat on a single head heavier, lonelier, and more vulnerable to the currents of court politics. In ancient Egypt, a queen who lost her brother husband might retreat into the inner chambers of the palace, her appearances at court reduced to rare, solemn processions draped in white linen, a color of mourning. Priests would speak of her as a living goddess carrying on the divine legacy alone, yet in private, she might sit by the lotus pools at dusk, staring at the rippling water as memories of their shared youth and years of rule together rose unbidden. The throne, once a shared burden, became a solitary weight, and the whispers of succession began to swirl advisors debating whether she should marry another brother, if one remained, or a cousin, to preserve the sacred bloodline. In Spain, the death of a Habsburg king left his cousin queen both a widow and the reigning, symbol of a line already weakened by generations of intermarriage. She would don black silk and attend mass daily, her figure moving slowly through the incense-thick air of the cathedral, while ministers met behind closed doors to decide which distant relative might inherit a crown that had no healthy direct heir. The portraits painted of her in this period showed a face both regal and hollowed, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, the jawline unmistakably bearing the family mark. In Hawaii, the passing of a royal brother left his sister queen standing, alone at the head of the alii, her voice carrying through ceremonial chants, without the deep counterpoint that had always balanced it. The people still bowed, the kahili standard still waved in the wind, but the symmetry of the royal pair was broken, and with it, some of the perceived mana that their union had embodied. For all these rulers, grief was not something they could fully express. Their mourning had to be filtered through ritual, their tears shed in private moments that only the most trusted attendants might witness. The political dangers where immediate rivals saw an opening. Foreign powers sent envoys to offer condolences, while quietly assessing the opportunity to press claims or forge new alliances. The absence of the sibling spouse also stripped away the one person in court who truly understood the unique, often suffocating bond of such a marriage. Without that shared perspective, the surviving ruler could feel adrift, surrounded by advisors and relatives who spoke in platitudes, but could not fathom the complexity of having lost both a sibling and a sovereign partner in one breath. In some cases, the survivor remarried quickly, as tradition or necessity demanded, often to another close relative, restarting the cycle that had brought them to this moment. In others, they ruled alone until death, their reigns marked by an air of endurance rather than renewal. Either path carried its risks. Remarriage might deepen the genetic fragility of the line, while solitary rule often left succession dangerously uncertain. The personal toll was rarely recorded in official chronicles, but in the margins of letters, in the private diaries of courtiers, and the fading memories of servants, the truth endured a ruler diminished not only by loss, but by the knowledge that the survival of their dynasty was slipping beyond their grasp. In the next part, we will step into the final act of these bloodlines, when the death of one sibling is followed by the death of the other, and with them, the end of a dynasty that had once seemed eternal. The end of a dynasty bound by sibling. Marriage rarely came with a single dramatic collapse. More often, it unfolded like a slow extinguishing of candles in a great hall, one by one, the flames guttering out until only darkness remained. The surviving monarch, already bearing the weight of both crown and grief, would often linger for years in a palace that felt far too large, walking past rooms heavy with memories, portraits that stared back with eerily familiar features, and empty corridors where the echo of footsteps seemed to follow them. In Egypt, a sister queen who outlived her brother husband might sit for hours in the audience chamber, listening to petitions she barely heard, her mind drifting to the days when they had stood together as the living embodiment of gods. The priests still performed their rites, the scribes still recorded her decrees, but the vitality of the dynasty had already seeped away, drained by centuries of bloodlines circling back upon themselves. In Spain, the last of the Habsburgs, Charles II, died without an heir in 1700, his body a testament to the genetic toll of generations of intermarriage. A jaw so malformed it was difficult to eat, a frail frame, and a lifetime of illness. His death not only ended his line, but triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, as foreign powers scrambled to fill the void left by a bloodline too pure to survive itself. In Hawaii, the eventual dissolution of sibling marriage as a royal tradition did not come with a single ruler's death, but rather with the gradual blending of the alii bloodlines into broader society, the symbolic power of mana giving way to the political realities of the modern age. Yet even here, the stories of the last sibling married royals carried a bittersweet weight, their passing marking the end of an era as surely as any abdication or overthrow. In each case, the extinction of the dynasty was both a political and a deeply personal event. For the monarch, the approach of death was accompanied by the knowledge that there would be no child to follow, no direct heir to inherit the traditions, the rituals, the centuries of carefully guarded heritage. Advisors might attempt to prepare for a transfer of power, searching the tangled branches of the family tree for distant cousins or negotiating with foreign claimants. But the sense of continuity that monarchy thrives on was irreparably broken. The final days of these rulers were often marked by a strange mixture of ceremony and solitude. State visits conducted with great pomp, even as the monarch's health visibly declined. Lavish feasts held in echoing halls that felt emptier than ever. Funeral preparations quietly discussed in back rooms long before they were needed. Servants, ministers, and relatives all understood that they were witnessing the closing of a chapter that would never be reopened. When death finally came, it was met with the tolling of bells, the draping of black cloth over palace gates, and the slow, solemn processions of mourners through the streets. The throne rooms, once the stage for carefully choreographed displays of sibling unity, stood empty save for the great chair of state, draped in mourning colors. The symbols of power, the crown, the scepter, the seal, were either passed to foreign hands or locked away in treasuries, relics of a vanished order. Chroniclers wrote of these endings with a kind of reverent finality, glossing over the genetic fragility that had hastened the dynasty's demise, preferring instead to frame it as the will of the gods or the turning of fate's wheel. But the truth lingered in the private memories of those who had served these rulers closely. The cough that never went away, the child who never walked, the queen who could not bear another pregnancy, the king whose mind faltered long before his body gave out. And so, the grand lineages that had once claimed divine right or sacred manna faded into history, leaving behind both the monuments of their greatness and the cautionary tale of their decline. In the next part, we will step back from the extinguished thrones and look across history at the patterns that emerge when sibling marriage is used as a tool of power, patterns that show not only the dangers of such unions, but the universality of their human cost. The universality of their human cost becomes clearer when we step back and look across centuries and continents for the pattern of sibling or close-kin marriage as a means of consolidating power was not limited to a handful of famous dynasties, but appeared in different guises and cultures as far apart as the Nile Delta, the Andes, the Pacific Islands, and the courts of medieval Europe. In each setting, the rationale was cloaked in the language of necessity, religious duty, divine will, cultural tradition, political survival, but beneath those justifications lay the same core calculation: keep wealth, influence, and legitimacy locked within the smallest possible circle, even if it meant binding siblings together in marriage. Among the Inca of pre-Columbian Peru, the Sapa Inca often married his sister, the Coya, not only to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline, but to embody a living symbol of cosmic balance, with their union mirroring that of the sun god Inti and his sister wife. The pageantry of these marriages rivaled anything seen in the courts of Egypt or Europe, with golden headdresses, vast processions, and feasts that lasted for days. Yet the same biological risks lurked beneath the gilded surfaces shortened. Lifespans for heirs, recurrent health problems, and the quiet anxiety that too many generations of such unions might weaken rather than strengthen the line. In the Polynesian islands beyond Hawaii, high chiefs sometimes married sisters or half-sisters to maintain the sanctity of chiefly mana, with ceremonies steeped in chants, symbolic offerings, and displays of genealogy that stretched back into mythic time. Here, too, the practice was framed as sacred, and questioning it could be seen as questioning the very foundation of leadership. In medieval and early modern Europe, beyond the Habsburgs, cousin marriages and, in rarer cases, sibling unions appeared. In smaller principalities, often under papal dispensation when political advantage outweighed canon law. The results were often the same: dynasties locked in webs of interrelatedness, so dense that family trees resembled labyrinths. Their heirs, carrying both the political advantages and the genetic liabilities of such concentrated lineage. What is striking in all these cases is how similar the human consequences were, despite vast cultural differences. The ceremonies and symbols varied: golden thrones or feathered standards, cathedral bells or conch-shell trumpets, but the private struggles were familiar. The pressure to produce heirs, the heartbreak of losing children, the subtle or not so subtle signs of hereditary illness appearing in each generation. And everywhere there was the same reluctance to break the pattern, even in the face of mounting evidence that it was eroding the dynasty from within. This reluctance was fueled not only by fear of political dilution, but by the deep embedding of these practices into cultural and religious identities. To abandon sibling marriage was not just to change a policy, it was to alter the narrative that a dynasty told about itself, the story that justified its right to rule. And so the pattern persisted, century after century, across oceans and empires, until the forces of modernity, colonialism, nationalism, the rise of constitutional governments, the advent of modern genetics, began to sweep away the old structures that had supported it. Yet even as sibling marriage faded from the political stage, its legacy lingered in the form of dynasties, remembered as both magnificent and doomed, their monuments standing as much for their glory as for the fragility that ended them. In the next part, we will look more closely at this legacy, exploring how the descendants, whether literal or cultural, of these sibling marriage dynasties have grappled with their heritage in the centuries since the practice faded into history. The descendants, whether direct blood heirs or distant relatives, linked through centuries of branching genealogies, have had to live with a legacy that is as much myth and cautionary tale as it is family history. In some cases, modern descendants of these sibling marriage dynasties still carry the unmistakable physical traits that once defined their lines, though softened by generations of more diverse unions. A certain set of the jaw reminiscent of the Habsburgs, a striking resemblance to portraits of Ptolemaic queens, or the high cheekbones and regal bearing of Hawaiian alii. For some, these features are a source of quiet pride, a living connection to the grandeur of a royal past. For others, they are a reminder of the genetic risks and personal tragedies that came with the crown. In Egypt, the lineage of the Ptolemies ended long ago, yet their story survives in both archaeological grandeur and whispered legend tour guides leading visitors through the columns of temples still point to reliefs of sibling couples as proof of divine rulership, glossing over the human cost. In Spain and Austria, modern Habsburg descendants sometimes speak openly about their family's history, acknowledging the dangers of the inbreeding that produced such recognizable traits, while also defending the political logic of the era. Have taken part in genetic studies, allowing scientists to trace the hereditary impact of centuries of intermarriage, their DNA revealing both resilience and fragility. In Hawaii, where the alii bloodlines have blended into the broader population, the cultural memory of sibling marriage remains part of a larger conversation about sovereignty, tradition, and the complex ways in which indigenous leadership adapted or was forced to adapt under foreign influence. For many descendants, grappling with this history means balancing reverence for tradition with a recognition of its limits. Museums and historical societies now present exhibits that confront the practice head-on, pairing portraits and regalia with explanations of how the genetic bottleneck of sibling marriage contributed to dynastic decline. Yet the narratives remain layered. In some circles, the old marriages are still spoken of in terms of sacred duty and political necessity. In others, they are framed as examples of the dangers of placing ideology above human health. The modern world has also given these stories new life through media films, novels, documentaries, often romanticizing the opulence while hinting at or dramatizing the tragedy. The tragedy. This public fascination means that descendants can find themselves both celebrated and scrutinized, their identities tangled with historical perceptions they had no part in shaping. Some embrace the connection, becoming active storytellers of their family's past. Others keep it at arm's length, unwilling to be defined by decisions made centuries before their birth. There is also a quiet undercurrent of scientific curiosity. Genealogists, historians, and geneticists continue to map and analyze these lines, using them as case studies in both human history and the biological consequences of extreme endogamy. For the descendants, participating in such research can feel like reclaiming the narrative, turning a legacy of secrecy into one of open examination. And yet, despite the distance of centuries, the shadow of the practice still lingers. To stand in a palace where siblings once ruled together, to trace one's face in the brushstrokes of an ancestor's portrait, is to feel the strange duality of inheritance, the pride of continuity, and the weight of the choices that ensured it. In the next part, we will turn our gaze fully to the present and examine how the lessons of these royal unions echo in modern political, cultural, and even scientific thought, reminding us that the tension between preserving identity and embracing change is as relevant now as it was in the age of sibling kings and queens. As relevant now as it was in the age of sibling kings and queens, the tension between preserving identity and ensuring survival plays out in modern arenas that would have been unrecognizable to those ancient rulers. Yet the underlying dilemmas feel hauntingly familiar. Today, the concept of pure blood still surfaces in political, cultural, and even social debates, though it is no longer framed in terms of divine right or royal lineage, but in conversations about heritage, tradition, and the fear of losing cultural distinctiveness in an interconnected world. The history of sibling marriage and royal bloodlines offers a stark lesson in the dangers of pushing purity to its extreme. The very thing meant to preserve a legacy can become the instrument of its undoing. Genetic science now explains in clinical terms what ancient courts intuited but could not name. The concentration of hereditary traits through close kin unions increases the risk of recessive disorders, infertility, and reduced resilience against disease. Yet even with this knowledge, the metaphor of the closed circle persists, whether in small communities reluctant to marry outside their group, or in organizations and movements that resist any form of external influence. The parallels to royal sibling unions lie in the balance or imbalance between self-protection and adaptability. In cultural terms, many modern societies wrestle with how to honor traditions without locking themselves into insularity. The Hawaiian ally has eventual openness to alliances outside sibling marriage under political and missionary pressure mirrors. In some ways, the choices faced by contemporary communities under the pressure of globalization. In political terms, dynastic families, though no longer ruling as absolute monarchs, still grapple with marriage expectations and alliances that preserve power within a narrow elite, even if the biological risks are now mitigated by wider family networks. On a scientific level, the genetic records of sibling married dynasties have become valuable datasets, allowing researchers to study not only the effects of inbreeding, but also how certain traits persisted or faded over centuries. The willingness of some modern descendants to contribute to this research signals a shift from secrecy to transparency, a recognition that understanding the past can help prevent its mistakes from repeating. There is also a symbolic resonance in how these histories are taught. In classrooms, museums, and media, the fall of inbred dynasties often serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of placing ideology, pride, or fear of outsiders above the pragmatic needs of survival. Yet these lessons are not always received in the spirit intended. Just as in centuries past, some audiences romanticize the image of unbroken lineage, focusing on the opulence of palaces and ceremonies, while ignoring the private suffering they concealed. The challenge, then, is to tell these stories in ways that capture both the grandeur and the gravity, to show that the jewels and marble columns were built on human choices with human consequences. In this sense, the shadow of sibling royal marriage is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting the ongoing human struggle to navigate between holding on and letting go, between guarding what is precious and allowing it to evolve. In the next part, we will turn toward the final chapters of our journey, drawing together the threads of history, science, and human experience to see how the echoes of these ancient unions still shape the way we think about power, identity, and legacy today. The way we think about power, identity, and legacy today is inevitably shaped by the weight of these histories. For the echoes of sibling royal marriages linger not only in the stones of palaces and the pages of history books, but in the very language we use to talk about purity, heritage, and continuity. To walk through the ruins of a Ptolemaic temple, the grand halls of the Escorial in Spain, or the preserved royal compounds of Hawaii, is to move through spaces where political ideology was once written into the bodies of the rulers themselves, where every ritual, every marriage, every child born or lost was both a personal moment and a calculated act of state. The marble busts, the oil paintings, the carved wooden thrones, they are silent now. But they once bore witness to a living system in which bloodlines were as carefully managed as treasuries and armies. And yet, for all the precision with which these unions were arranged, the outcomes were never fully within human control. Illness, infertility, and the slow genetic narrowing caused by repeated close-kin unions could not be willed away by divine titles or gilded ceremonies. The story of sibling royal marriage is, at its heart, a study in the limits of power, how even those who seemed to command the fates of nations could not escape the biological truths that govern all life. This is why the subject resonates beyond mere curiosity. It speaks to the universal reality that power has boundaries, and that the choices we make to protect it can sometimes hasten its loss. As we look back, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The initial justifications rooted in religion or cultural identity, the consolidation of power through marriages within the family, the gradual accumulation of hereditary weaknesses, the political instability brought on by sickly heirs or empty thrones, the occasional moment of reform when an outsider was brought into the bloodline, and finally, the twilight years of a dynasty, ending not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet closing of a door in an empty palace. These stages repeat across centuries and cultures, from the Nile to the Andes, from the courts of Vienna to the shores of the Pacific. And always, woven into the narrative, are the human beings at the center, sometimes complicit in the system, sometimes trapped by it, sometimes quietly resisting it in ways too subtle for the history books to capture. To consider their lives is to see beyond the symbols of crowns and scepters, to recognize the shared human experiences of love constrained, duty enforced, and loss endured. It is also to acknowledge that while the context of sibling marriage in royal dynasties may be gone, the underlying tensions it represented between tradition and change, identity and adaptability are still with us. We see them in debates about cultural preservation, in questions of who has the right to belong, and in the ways communities define themselves against the outside world. The past becomes a lens through which to examine the present, and in doing so, we see that the lessons of these royal unions are not locked away in the past at all. They are living, breathing considerations in how we shape our legacies today. As we move now into the final part of this journey, we will slow our steps, letting the weight of all these stories settle, and consider what remains when the crowns have tarnished, the genealogies have ended, and the voices of kings and queens have faded into the hush of history. When the voices of kings and queens have faded into the hush of history, What remains are the faint outlines of their choices, pressed like watermarks into the paper of time, visible only when the light hits at the right angle. The story of sibling inbreeding and royal bloodlines is not just a catalog of marriages, illnesses, and dynastic collapses. It is a meditation on how power can shape the most intimate corners of life, bending love, family, and even the human body to its will. In the ruins of Egyptian temples, the carved faces of brother-sister rulers still gaze out with serene divinity, their features frozen in idealized perfection, the human cost erased in stone. In the painted halls of Spanish palaces, portraits of Habsburg monarchs still hang in gilded frames, their stiff poses concealing the fragility of the blood that sustained their crowns. In Hawaii's royal compounds, chants still recall the mana of sibling unions, voices carrying echoes of an age when tradition and authority were inseparable. Yet in all these places, the silence speaks as loudly as the surviving art and architecture. It speaks of children who never reached adulthood, of rulers who carried both the crown and the burden of their family's genetic narrowing, of dynasties that believed they were fortifying themselves even as they hollowed out their foundations. Throughout this journey, we have walked through candlelit bedchambers and crowded coronation halls, through gardens where queens whispered their grief to the wind, and through council chambers where advisors weighed the risks of change against the comfort of tradition. We have seen the calculated coldness of political unions between siblings, the tenderness that could sometimes grow within them, and the quiet rebellions that flickered in the shadows of thrones. And now, as we close the circle, we are left with the enduring truth that power, when hoarded too tightly, begins to consume itself. The crowns may have been passed down for centuries, but the blood beneath them was not infinite. It carried the memories, the strengths, and the weaknesses of every union that came before. In the end, the legacy of sibling royal marriages is both magnificent and melancholy. A melancholy reminder that the symbols we build to last forever are still bound by the mortal limits of the bodies that bear them. Perhaps that is why these stories still hold our fascination. They are not just about the strange customs of the past, but about the eternal human struggle to reconcile the desire for permanence with the necessity of change. As you sit here now, perhaps in the quiet of night, eyes heavy, the images of these rulers drifting in your mind like fading constellations, you may find yourself wondering how your own story will be remembered, what traditions you will preserve, and which you will let go. And maybe, as you close your eyes, you will hear in the distance not the clash of armies or the roar of crowds, but the softer sounds that have always carried history forward, the turn of a page, the whisper of a name, the breath drawn before, a choice that will shape everything that comes after. If your eyes are closing now, let them close. If you are still awake, know that other stories are waiting, other strange, quiet histories to unfold in the stillness. Until then, remember that even the most guarded bloodlines, no matter how tightly they draw their circles, are part of the same vast human family. Sleep well, and let the past keep its watch until we meet again.